Good morning. Today's lecture is entitled The Red Summer of 1919 and How Black World War I Veterans Fought Back Against Racist Mobs. As I stated before, African Americans will participate in World War I. But as in all other conflicts up to that time, African American soldiers will be treated differently than their white counterparts. In fact, we know from a Freedom of Information search, which any of us can do, we found out about how the United States government during World War I would communicate with the French, especially, and provide instructions as to how black soldiers were supposed to be treated and how they were the French were especially supposed to make sure that the black soldiers had very limited contact with the French women. And the United States, the United States into this conflict will tip the scales so that the Allies will be in the most advantageous position to win, and that's what will occur. So in 1919, then, we will have the signing of what is the document that's known as the Treaty of Versailles. Versailles is pronounced Versailles in Kentucky. Treaty of Versailles will be in World War I, and it will be signed in the city of Versailles, which is in France. And that will mean then that the black soldiers, they'll be veterans now, they will be returning from Europe and returning home. And of course, the question that they're going to be facing is how will they be treated? And not only how will they be treated, but how will they respond? Historians know that you could almost say the ink was not dry on the Treaty of Versailles when newly returned black veterans had to grab their guns and station themselves on rooftops in black neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. And they had to prepare to act as snipers in case of mob violence in July of 1919. And this mob violence was whites that were attacking students at Howard University. So these black veterans will set up blockades around Howard University to create a protective ring around the residents of the area and, of course, the students of Howard University. And white sailors who recently had returned home from the war some of them had been on days-long drunken rampages in D.C. And they had been assaulting, in some cases, lynching black people on the streets of the capital of the United States. And the relentless onslaught proved contagious, and it will escalate and spread to dozens of cities across the United States in what we now call the Red Summer of 1919. So it started in Washington, D.C. because of white sailors who recently had returned home from the war, went on days-long drunken rampages in D.C., assaulting and sometimes lynching black people on the streets of Washington, D.C. And newly returned black veterans did not cower in fear. What they will do is they will get their guns and they will get on the rooftops of the neighborhood and they will act as snipers to protect African Americans in D.C., especially around the Howard University campus. The racist attacks in 1919 were widespread, and they were often indiscriminate. But in many places, they were initiated by white servicemen and will center upon the 380,000 black veterans who had just returned from the war. So I'm saying that there were 380,000 black veterans who returned from World War I. And it would almost be like the anger was taken out on them. It was, as one document will say, quote, because of their military service, black veterans were seen as a particular threat to Jim Crow and racial subordination, unquote. And indeed, many of these African Americans or black soldiers will return from the war armed with a renewed determination to fight desegregation and a near constant barrage of brutality. In other words, they weren't going to take it anymore. A postal official wrote at the time, quote, as far back as the first movement of the American troops to France, the Negro publicists began to avail themselves of the argument that since the Negro was fit to wear the uniform, he was therefore fit for everything else, unquote. That to say simply, if he could die, if the black soldier could die for this country, then the black soldier deserved the rights that all citizens were supposed to receive by being citizens of the United States. And in Texas, one federal agent reported, quote, one of the principal elements causing concern is the returned Negro soldier, who is not readily fitting back into the prior status of pre-war times, unquote. The black soldier was not going back, stepping back and fitting neatly into the system that existed before they went to war. At the same time, across the North, in cities across the North, they were being reshaped by the Great Migration. By the end of 1919, there was about 1 million African Americans who had fled segregation and a total lack of economic opportunities in the South. And as I tried to explain in the previous lecture, they had gone to the cities in the North and in the West and the Midwest. For example, between 1910 and 1920, the black population in Chicago grew by 148%. In Philadelphia, the black population in that same time period, 1910 to 1920, grew by 500%. And this was going to create massive anxiety among white people in these cities that, of course, black people were taking their jobs, taking their houses, and, of course, there was not going to be any security. So during the Red Summer, this anxiety will lead to mass violence. And between April and November of 1919, there will be approximately 25 riots and instances of mob violence in the United States. There will be 97 recorded lynchings, and recorded lynchings would be lynchings that we definitely know about, and a three-day long massacre in Elaine, Arkansas. And during this three-day massacre in Elaine, Arkansas, over 200 black men, women, and children were killed after black sharecroppers tried to organize for better working conditions. So I want to repeat that then. 25 race riots, 97 recorded lynchings, and a three-day-long massacre in Elaine, Arkansas. And in the one in Elaine, Arkansas, over 200 black men, women, and children were killed because the sharecroppers, the black sharecroppers, tried to organize for better working conditions. And the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, which had largely shut down the government after the Civil War, experienced a resurgence in popularity and began carrying out dozens of lynchings across the South. There are pictures, for example, of white children standing outside of a black residence owned by an African American that the white children had set on fire in September of 1919. Just a few years earlier, many of the young black men had heeded the call of President Woodrow Wilson to make the world safe for democracy. And these black men had gone off to fight for America in one of history's bloodiest wars. Now they had come back to a country that recognized neither their service nor their humanity. And having just returned from battle, however, these black veterans were not inclined to take the abuse lying down. And across the country, former soldiers, black soldiers, will use their government-provided weapons training to defend their neighborhood against vicious white mobs. One professor at the University of Iowa writes, quote, black people formed ad hoc self-defense organizations to try to keep white folks from terrorizing their communities, unquote. Black veterans were a large part of what made the summer of 1919 in the year that you could say that African Americans will fight back. Um, Dr. W.B. Du Bois will write in The Crisis magazine in May of 1919, quote, "This is the country to which we soldiers of democracy return. This is the motherland for which we fought," unquote. And he wrote that, as I said, in May of 1919, a month after the earliest event of the Red Summer. And that will be a riot in Georgia. Riot in Georgia where 6 people, excuse me, 2 white police officers and 4 black men were killed at a church. And Du Bois will say, quote, "But by the God of heaven, we are cowards and jackasses if now that war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land," unquote. So let's talk about some of these incidents. First one we'll pick up with is in Washington, D.C. And the president this time was Woodrow Wilson. I think it will be safe to say that the majority of American historians would say that if you're going to talk about racist presidents in this country, Andrew Jackson would be one of the big 3. Woodrow Wilson would be one of the big 3. And I'll let you decide which other one I would put into the category of one of the big 3. Woodrow Wilson was extremely racist. He will probably have a private viewing of the film, The Birth of a Nation. And I just can't describe Birth of a Nation. I can't do it. You'd have to look and do some research about this film and how powerful it was and how Woodrow Wilson had a viewing of The Birth of the Nation in the White House. And there's some other things that he did. So that's no doubt that Wilson was one of the most racist presidents this nation had. We know that Washington, D.C. had about 5,000 black veterans. And for many of them, self-defense was a last resort after weeks and indeed decades of government inaction. One of the first people killed in Washington, D.C.'s violence was a 22-year-old black veteran. His name was Randall Neal. At a high point of the mayhem, one Washington newspaper reported the city had, quote, "passed through its wildest and bloodiest night since Civil War times," unquote. Many of the city's white-owned newspapers fanned the flames of terror. They reported on fabricated instances of black men assaulting white women. That was usually, whether it was true or not, that was the number one reason that was given, and the newspapers played that up. In one case, the Washington Post, which was supposed to be a prestigious newspaper, ran a front-page story advertising the location for white servicemen to meet and to carry out further attacks on black people in the city. Washington, D.C. had a vibrant middle class that in many ways epitomized black people's slow but expanding economic and social advances. I guess you could say this was the Booker T. Washington dream in terms of progress was being made economically and socially. The city's black population was growing rapidly thanks to the Great Migration. And in 1919, black people made up a quarter of the population. They also held many jobs in the federal government. And at the country's first black-owned bank, the Industrial Savings Bank, they had created a black-owned bank, and it was the first one in the nation. It was a limited but steady march forward, one that many white people felt needed to be stopped. James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Black National Anthem, wrote, "I knew it to be true, but it was almost an impossibility for me to realize as a truth that men and women of my race were being mobbed, chased, dragged from streetcars, beaten, and killed within the shadow of the dome of the Capitol, at the very door of the White House, unquote. And not James Weldon Johnson will also be the one who will coin the term Red Summer and publish that and first use it in the Crisis magazine. Crisis magazine will be the publication of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And as the situation escalated, Wilson refused to act. He worried that the riots would damage his image he was cultivating of the United States as a global paragon of justice. And Wilson also had demonstrated a record of racism, including, you could say, unofficial support of the Ku Klux Klan. So he was worried about the riots damaging his image, but he did nothing to stop it. So after 4 days of racist mob violence in D.C., an estimated 40 people were killed, dozens more were injured, and the chaos was only quelled when 2,000 federal troops were deployed onto the city streets at the end of the month, just in time for the riots to spread to Chicago. What happened in Chicago? Okay. And there are also pictures of, if you do your research about what will happen at 29th Street Beach in Chicago after the drowning death of Eugene Williams, an African-American teenager who had crossed an imaginary boundary in the water separating blacks and whites. And so the day that we need to remember for Chicago, July 27, 1919. Just 2 days after the federal troops withdrew from Washington, D.C., a black teenager was killed. And he was killed by a white man in Chicago. And this will light the match that would kick off a week of violent riots. By the end of that week, 15 white people and 23 black people would be dead. Over 500 people would be injured, and over 1,000 black families would be homeless after their homes were burned down. The teenager, 17-year-old Eugene Williams, had been floating on a homemade raft off the shores of Lake Michigan, trying to escape the city's oppressive summer heat, when a white man named George Staver started pelting him with rocks. Wilson had unwittingly drifted past the line that divided the white beach from the black beach. A rock hit Williams in the head, and it knocked him unconscious. His body went limp, and he slipped into the lake, and no one got to Wilson in time to save him. A white police officer refused to arrest Staver, despite a growing crowd of angry witnesses to the murder. And by the time Wilson's lifeless body had been removed from the lake, a crowd of around 1,000 black people had gathered, demanding action. For African Americans, Wilson's death was a microcosm of the long-standing violence perpetrated against black people without consequences in Chicago. In response to the protest, armed white men will jump into cars and tear through the city streets. They will fire into black homes and businesses, and a white mob marched down the street, assaulting black pedestrians and torching black homes. Still, the police refused to act. Yes, and even once again, there are pictures, if you do research, and for example, the Chicago History Museum, there are pictures of these white mobs. When the riot explodes, it's not so much as some kind of a spontaneous event as if you could say it was a culmination of events. In other words, it just didn't happen. It is something that had been building up over time. And in 2 previous years, white supremacists had bombed over 25 homes owned by black people in Chicago in an effort to keep black people out of the city. The police, once again, never intervened. Veterans in Chicago formed militias to defend black homes. and neighborhoods and families when the police and the government refused. In the time following Williams' death, one group of black veterans broke into an armory and stole weapons, and then they used those weapons to beat back a white mob. Uh, and they did this because many of them had actually seen battlefield combat. They were willing and able of using violence for the purpose of self-defense. So throughout the summer of 1919, black veterans around the country took inspiration from the actions of their brothers in Washington, D.C. and Chicago and followed suit. In a ride in South Carolina, one preacher reportedly said of the black self-defense units, unquote, the males carried their guns with as much calmness as if they were going to shoot a rabbit in a hunt, or getting ready to shoot the Kaiser's soldiers. The Kaiser would be the leader of Germany at that time. And as the bloodshed began to spread across the nation, there would be incidents in South Carolina, Nebraska, Florida, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, among others, veterans who continued to be the target. At least 13 veterans were lynched across the United States after the World War I. Many of them were in their uniforms, which were worn in public. Many white people saw it as an affront to America's racial caste system to have a black soldier in a uniform. It was the opposite of the reception that many black soldiers believed that they would receive when they were returning home. They had chosen to serve in the war, spurred on by intellectuals like W.B. Du Bois. And W.B. Du Bois believed that helping the United States win the war would be put African Americans on the path to equality. He will write, quote, World War I was very much a broken promise for basically all black Americans are. Another historian will write that. Let me repeat that. This historian writes, quote, World War I was very much a broken promise for basically all African Americans. But the people who felt the brokenness of that promise most acutely were the veterans, who had gone and risked their lives for the supposed war to make the world safe for democracy, and then came home to find that the country was still going to deny African Americans the privilege of democracy. Unquote. This wasn't unique to the Red Summer or even World War I. A report by the Equal Justice Initiative, and that will be the group that is responsible for the lynching memorial that is in Montgomery, Alabama. I know Pat has been there to visit, and I encourage all the rest of you to go to visit. The Equal Justice Initiative found that from Reconstruction to just after World War II, thousands of black voters, not just thousands of black veterans, were assaulted, threatened, abused, or lynched following military service. No one was more at risk of experiencing violence and targeted racial terror than black veterans who had proved their valor and courage as soldiers during the Civil War, World War I, World War II. You could add the Spanish-American War, the Mexican-American War. Anytime they had the opportunity, they had to prove their courage. But despite the events of World War I and the Red Summer, 1.2 million black men would enlist in World War II. So I want you to keep this in mind. Despite what will happen in the summer of 1919, after World War I, we now know that 1.2 million black men will enlist in World War II. Now, of course, some of that will be because of the draft. The conclusion of the summer of 1919 would not be the end of mass violence against black Americans. Far from it. 2 years later, we see one of the worst instances of racial violence in American history, and that would be the Tulsa Race Massacre. This was in the news not too long ago because our former president decided to visit Tulsa close to the 100th anniversary of this event occurring. And he well, the bottom line, more people found out about the Tulsa race riot because of Donald Trump inadvertently scheduling to go to Tulsa when they were going to commemorate the what took place in Tulsa. In Tulsa, a white mob will attack residents, destroy homes and businesses in the predominantly black Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa. News reports of the event were largely squelched, despite the fact that up to 300 people were killed and thousands left homeless. And if I'm mistaken, this was also the time that the government will use planes to bomb citizens of the United States. Fortunately, the government, the local government of Tulsa is very repentant now, and there is a search on to find and to cover and to exhume and rebury the graves of African Americans, many African Americans who got buried in unmarked graves. I think the plan is to exhume the bodies and to give them a decent burial. So the city is now recognizing and dealing with that. Okay. It did, however, signal a permanent shift in the way black people responded to white violence in the United States. And it will be an indicator of increasing self-defense tactics, including when black veterans once again mobilized during the violence in Tulsa. Black veterans once again mobilized in Tulsa, and you could say without them it would have been worse. So for many black people, the way veterans responded to the bloodshed added a sliver of inspiration to the terror of that summer. Before the war, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had 9,000 members. Yet by the early 1920s, it had grown to 100,000 members, signaling a growing boldness and cohesion to the organizing that would eventually plant the seeds of the civil rights movement. So part of what I'm saying is that, and to a degree, the philosophy of Booker T. Washington is you have to plant the seeds and the seeds have to grow. And as you look back and what happened in the summer of 1919, the racial riots that occurred, you see the black veterans respond with courage and being willing to fight for their community. And that will be, like I said, the seed that will help lead to what will occur in the 1960s with the civil rights movement. All right. And I did mention that there will be an incident in Kentucky, and one of those incidents will be in Corbin, Kentucky. If you go down I-75, it is at Corbin's exit 25 and 29. And to this day, Corbin is trying to deal with what occurred in 1919 when they ran all of the African Americans out of town. There's still a lot of African Americans who know about what happened in Corbin that still see Corbin as a sundown city. And some will not even stop at Corbin because of that. So, that's it. Summer of 1919. Red Summer of 1919. Phrase created by James Weldon Johnson, who wrote the lyrics to Lift Every Voice and sang the Black National Anthem. All right. Take care.